isolation and relationship. The experience of existential isolation produces a highly uncomfortable subjective state, and as is the case with any form of dysphoria, is not tolerated by the individual for long. Unconscious defenses work on it and quickly bury it out of the purview of conscious experience. The defenses must work without respite because the isolation is within one, always waiting to be recognized. The waves of the ether, as Martin Buber says, roar on always, but for most of the time we have turned off our receivers. How does one shield oneself from the dread of ultimate isolation? One may take a portion of the isolation into oneself and bear it courageously or, to use Heidegger's term, resolutely. As for the rest, one attempts to give up singleness and to enter into relationship with another, with either a being like oneself or a divine being. The major buttress against the terror of existential isolation is thus relational in nature, and my discussion of the clinical manifestations of existential isolation must perforce center on interpersonal relationships. In accent, however, I shall differ from traditional discussions of interpersonal psychology. I shall focus not on such needs as security, attachment, self-validation, satisfaction of lust, or power, but instead shall view relationships according to how they assuage fundamental and universal isolation. No relationship can eliminate isolation. Each of us is alone in existence. Yet our noses can be shared in such a way that love compensates for the pain of isolation. A great relationship, says Buber, breaches the barriers of a lofty solitude, subdues its strict law, and throws a bridge from self-being to self-being across the abyss of dread of the universe. I believe that if we are able to acknowledge our isolated situations in existence and to confront them with resoluteness, we will be able to turn lovingly toward others. If, on the other hand, we are overcome with dread before the abyss of loneliness, we will not reach out toward others but instead will flail at them, in order not to drown in the sea of existence. In this instance, our relationships will not be true relationships at all but out of joint, miscarriages, distortions of what might have been. We will not relate to others with a full sense of them as like ourselves, as sentient beings, also alone, also frightened, also carving out a world of at-homeness from the paste of things. We behave toward other beings as toward tools or equipment. The other, now no longer an other but an it, is placed there within one circle of world for function. The fundamental function, of course, is isolation denial, but awareness of this function is too close to the lurking terror. Greater concealment is needed. Metaphantascans emerge, and we constitute relationships that provide a product. For example, power, fusion, protection, greatness or adoration, that in turn serves to deny isolation. There is nothing novel in this psychic defensive organization. Every explanatory system of behavior posits some core conflict that is encrusted with layers of protective and concealing dynamisms. These miscarried relationships with their products, their functions, and their metaphantascans constitute what clinicians refer to as interpersonal psychopathology. I shall describe the clinical picture of many forms of pathological relationship and discuss the existential dynamics of each. But in order to understand fully what relationship is not, it is necessary first to apprehend what, in the best of ways, a relationship can be. Need-free love. A relationship, at its best, involves individuals who relate to one another in a need-free fashion. Yet how is it possible to love another for the other, and not for what that other provides for the lover? How can we love without using, without a quid pro quo, without a mainsail of infatuation, lust, admiration, or self-service? Many wise thinkers have addressed this question, and I shall begin by reviewing their contributions. Martin Buber. In the beginning is the relation. Thus proclaimed Martin Buber, a philosopher and theologian whose patriarchal appearance, complete to piercing gaze and full white beard, augmented the power of his philosophical pronouncements. Buber has had an extraordinary impact on both religious philosophy and modern psychiatric theory. His posture is an unusual one, straddling Jewish mystical thought and Hasidism on the one hand and modern relational theory on the other. His proclamation in the beginning is the relation is rooted in these traditions. Buber was part of a mystical tradition that believes that every individual is part of the covenant. Each contains a divine spark that in concert reveal the holy presence. Thus every individual is united in that each has a cosmic, spiritual association to the universe. Buber believed that longing for relationship was innate and given, and that in his mother's, whomever man knows that is related to the universe and forgets it at birth. The child has a drive for contact. Originally tactile, and then optimal, contact with another being. The child knows of no I. He knows of no other state of being than relation. Man, Buber stated, does not exist as a separate entity. Man is a creature of the between. There are two basic types of relationships. Thus, two types of in-betweeners, which Buber characterized etho, sometimes translated as I, you, and I. The I-ed relationship is the relationship between a person and equipment, a functional relationship, a relationship between subject and object wholly lacking mutuality. The I-thou relationship is a wholly mutual relationship involving a full experiencing of the other. It differs from empathy, imaginatively viewing a situation from the other's perspective, because it is more than an I attempting to relate to another. There is no T as such, but only the basic word I-thou. Relation is reciprocity. Not only is the thou of the I-thou relationship different from the it in the I-it relationship, and not only are the natures of the I, thou and the I-it relationships vastly different, but there is even a more fundamental difference. The very I is different in the two situations. It is not the I that has preeminent reality. An I that can decide to relate to its, or thous that are objects floating into one's field of vision. No, the I is betweeners. The I appears and is shaped in the context of some relationship. Thus the I is profoundly influenced by the relationship with the thou. With each thou, and with each moment of relationship, the I is created anew. When relating to it, whether to a thing or to a person made into a thing, one holds back something of oneself. One inspects it from many possible perspectives, one categorizes it, analyzes it, judges it, and decides upon its position in the grand scheme of things. But when one relates to a thou, one's whole being is involved, nothing can be withheld. The basic word I you can be spoken only with one's whole being. The concentration and fusion into a whole being can never be accomplished by me, can never be accomplished without me. I require a you to becoming I say you. If one relates to another with less than one's whole being, if one holds something back by. For example, relating through greed or anticipation of some return, or if one remains in the objective attitude, a spectator, and wonders about the impression one's actions will make on the other. Then one has transferred an I, thou encounter into an I at one. If one is to relate truly to another, one must truly listen to the other. Relinquish stereotypes and anticipations of the other, and allow oneself to be shaped by the other's response. Buber's distinction between genuine and pseudo-listening obviously has important implications for the therapeutic relationship. To relate to another in a needless fashion, one must lose or transcend oneself. My favorite illustration of an I, thou relationship is Buber's description of himself and his horse when he was a youth. When I was 11 years of age, spending the summer on my grandparents' estate, I used, as often as I could do it on a bustard, to steal into the stable and gently stroke the neck of my darling, a broad dapple gray horse. It was not a casual delight but a great, certainly friendly, but also deeply stirring happening. If I am to explain it now, beginning from the still very fresh memory of my hand, I must say that what I experienced in touch with the animal was the other. The immense otherness of the other, which, however, did not remain strange like the otherness of the ox and the ram, but rather let me draw near and touch it. When I stroked the mighty mane, sometimes marvellously smooth-combed, at other times just as astonishingly wild, and felt the life beneath my hand. It was as though the element of vitality itself bordered on my skin, something that was not I. Was certainly not akin to me, palpably the other. Not just another, really the other itself. And yet it let me approach, confided itself to me, placed itself elementally in the relation of thou and thou with me. The horse, even when I had not begun by pouring oats for him into the manger, very gently raised his massive head, ears flicking, then snorted quietly, as a conspirator gives a signal meant to be recognizable only by his fellow conspirator. And I was approved. But one time, I do not know what came over the child. At any rate, it was childlike enough. It struck me about the stroking, what fun it gave me, and suddenly I became conscious of my hand. The game went on as before, but something had changed. It was no longer the same thing. And the next day, after giving him a rich feed, when I stroked my friend's head, he did not raise his head. The basic experiential mode of EI, thou is dialogue, in which, either silently or spoken, each of the participants has in mind the other or others in their particular being and turns to them with the intention of establishing a living mutual relation between himself and them. Dialogue is simply the turning toward another with one's whole being. When the young Boober turned away from the horse, became aware of his hand, and of how much pleasure the stroking afforded him. Then dialogue vanished, and monologue, and the eye reigned. Boober termed this turning away from the other reflection. In reflection, not only is one concerned with himself, but, even more important, one forgets about the particular being of the other. Viktor Frankl makes a similar point when he deplores the present-day vulgarization of the concept of encounter. Frankl argues, and quite correctly I believe, that encounter as it often occurs in the basic encounter group is no encounter at all, but instead a self-expression. An adoration of affect discharge whose rationale is rooted in a psychological monadology which pictures the human being as a windowless cell. A creature who cannot transcend oneself, who cannot turn toward the other. Consequently, there is, too often, an emphasis on getting one's aggression out, on beating a pillow or a punching bag, on self-esteem, on using others to solve ancient problems, on self-actualization. Instead of turning toward the other, there is, as Buber would say, sequential monologues disguised as dialogue. Buber asked for a great deal in an I-thou relationship. Once, for example, he was visited by an unknown young man who ostensibly had come for a chat. Buber found out much later that the stranger had a hidden agenda, that he was born by destiny and was on the verge of a momentous personal decision. Though Buber treated him in a friendly, considerate fashion, he berated himself for not being there in spirit, and for omitting to guess the questions the man did not put. But is it possible always to turn toward the other with such intensity? Obviously not, and Buber stressed that, though the I-thou constituted an ideal toward which one should strive, nonetheless it existed in only rare moments. One has to live primarily in the I world. To live solely in the thou world would result in one's burning oneself up in the white flame of the thou. The it world is the world in which one has to live and also can live comfortably. The thou moments appear as queer lyric dramatic episodes. Their spell may be seductive, but they pull us dangerously to extremes. One cannot live in the pure present, that is, in the I, though it would consume us. And in all the seriousness of truth, listen. That is, be in the eye thou without it a human being cannot live. But whoever lives only with that is not human. This plea for balance is reminiscent of Rabbi Hillel's well-known aphorism. If I am not for myself, who will be? And if I am only for myself, what am I? I have cited Buber extensively because his formulation of a need-less-love relationship is vivid and gripping. I cannot leave him without commenting upon an obvious tension between the fundamental position I have accorded to existential isolation and Buber's assertion that the human being does not exist as an I but is instead a creature of the in-between. Since Buber held that the human being's basic mode of existence is relational, he would accord no place in his system for existential isolation. He would protest at my positing that isolation is a fundamental aspect of our existential situation, and even more vigorously would he protest at my citing his work as part of my discussion. Yet let me look at an important dream with which Buber began between man and man. A recurrent dream which visited him, sometimes after an interval of several years, all his life. The dream, which Buber called the dream of the double cry, begins with his finding himself alone, in a vast cave, or a mud building, or on the fringes of a gigantic forest whose like I cannot remember having seen. Then something extraordinary occurs, like, for example, an animal tearing the flesh from his arm, and then I cry out. Each time it is the same cry, inarticulate but in strict rhythm, rising and falling, swelling to a fullness which my throat could not endure were I awake, long and slow, quite slow and very long, a cry that is a song. When it ends, my heart stops beating. But then, somewhere, far away, another cry mourns toward me, another which is the same cry uttered or sung by another voice. The responding cry is the critical event for Buber. As the reply ends, a certitude, true dream certitude, comes to me that now it has happened. Nothing more. Just this, and in this way. Now it has happened. If I should try to explain it, it means that happening which gave rise to my cry is only now, with the rejoinder, really and undoubtedly happened. Buber held that our basic mode of existence is relational, and in this dream, which he cited as a truth-giving vision, existence begins with the appearance of the relationship, the responding cry. Yet the dream text can, with grace, be interpreted differently. One begins, not in relationship, but alone and in an uncanny place. One is attacked and frightened. One cries out in an anticipation of a reply. One's heart stops beating. The dream speaks to me of fundamental isolation and suggests that our existence begins with a solitary, lonely cry, anxiously awaiting a response. Abraham Maslow, who died in 1970, has had immense influence on modern psychological theory. More than any other person, he must be regarded as the progenitor of humanistic psychology, a field that, as I discussed in the initial chapter, overlaps existential psychology at many points. Maslow is destined, in my view, to be rediscovered many times before the richness of his thought is fully assimilated. One of Maslow's fundamental propositions was that an individual's basic motivation is oriented toward either deficit or growth. Psychoneuroses, he thought, is a deficiency disease resulting from a lack of fulfillment, beginning early in life, of certain basic psychological needs. That is safety, belongings, identification, love, respect, prestige. Individuals who have these needs satisfied are growth-redeemed. They are able to realize their own innate potential for maturity and self-actualization. Growth-oriented individuals, in contrast to those with a deficiency orientation, are far more self-sufficient and far less dependent upon their environment for reinforcement or gratification. In other words, The determinants that govern them are not social or environmental but inner. The laws of their own inner nature, their potentialities and capacities, their talents, their latent resources, their creative impulses, their needs to know themselves and to become more and more integrated and unified. More and more aware of what they really are, of what they really want, of what their call or vocation or fate is to be. The growth-motivated person is less dependent, less beholden to others, less needful of others' praise and affection, less anxious for honors, prestige, and rewards. He or she does not require continual interpersonal need gratification, and, in fact, may at times feel hampered by others and prefer periods of privacy. Consequently, the growth-motivated individual does not relate to others as sources of supply, but is able to view them as complex, unique, whole beings. The deficiency-motivated individual, on the other hand, relates to others from the point of view of usefulness. Those aspects of the other that are not related to the perceiver's needs are either overlooked altogether or regarded as an irritant or a threat. Thus, as Maslow said, love is transformed into something else and resembles our relationships with cows, horses, and sheep, as well as with waiters, taxi cab drivers, porters, policemen, or others whom we use. Accordingly, Maslow described the types of love that are consonant with these two types of motivation: deficiency and growth. D love, deficiency love, is selfish love or love need, whereas B love, love for the being of another person, is unimpeding love or unselfish love. B love, he felt, is not possessive and is admiring rather than needing. It is a richer, higher, more valuable subjective experience than D love. B love can be gratified, whereas the concept of gratification hardly applies at all to B love. B love has within it a minimum of anxiety, hostility, but there can, of course, be anxiety for the other. B lovers are more independent of each other, more autonomous, less jealous or threatened, less needful, more disinterested, but also simultaneously more eager to help the other towards self-actualization, more proud of the other's triumphs, more altruistic, generous, and fostering. B love, in a profound sense, creates the partner, provides self-acceptance and a feeling of love-worthiness which enhances continued growth. Erich Fromm, in his jewel of a book, The Art of Loving, addressed the question with which Buber and Maslow struggled. What is the nature of need-free love? Indeed, it is striking and reassuring that these three seminal thinkers, each deriving from different backgrounds, theology, philosophy, experimental and social psychology, and psychoanalysis, arrived at similar conclusions. Fromm's starting point is that the human being's most fundamental concern is existential isolation, that the awareness of separateness is the source of all anxiety, and that our major psychological task, throughout the ages, has been the overcoming of separateness. Fromm discusses several historical attempts at solution. Creative activity, the union of artist with material and product, orgiastic states, religious, sexual, drug-induced, and conformity with customs and beliefs of the group. All of these attempts fall short. The unity in productive, creative, work is not interpersonal. The unity achieved in orgiastic fusion is transitory. The unity achieved by conformity is only pseudo-unity. Hence, they are only partial answers to the problem of existence. The full answer lies in the achievement of interpersonal union, a fusion with another person in love. What Fromm meant by the full answer is not clear, but I assume it to be the most satisfactory answer. Love does not take away our separateness. That is a given of existence and can be faced but never erased. Love is our best mode of coping with the pain of separateness. Buber, Maslow, and, as we shall see, Fromm arrived at similar formulations of needless love, but they started from different positions about the schema of love in the individual's life. Buber assumed that a state of love was the human being's natural state in existence, and that isolation was a fallen state. Maslow regarded love both as one of the innate human needs and potentials. Fromm considered love as a mode of coping, an answer to the problem of existence. A view close to my position in this book. Not all forms of love answer equally well the anguish of separateness. Fromm differentiated symbiotic union, a form of fallen love, from mature love. Symbiotic love, consisting of an active sadism and a passive masochism form, is a state of fusion where neither party is whole or free. I shall discuss this among the forms of malapedative love in the following section. Mature love is union under the condition of preserving one's integrity, one's individuality. In love, the paradox occurs that two beings become one, and yet remain two. Fromm traces the individual development of love from early childhood when one experiences being loved for what one is, or, perhaps more accurately, because one is. Later, between 8 and 10, a new factor enters the child's life. Awareness that one produces love by one's own activity. As the individual overcomes egocentricity, the needs of the other become as important as his or her own. And gradually the individual transforms the concept of love from being loved into loving. Fromm equates being loved with a state of dependency in which, by remaining small, helpless, or good, one is rewarded by being loved, whereas loving is an effective, potent state. Infantile love follows the principle, I love because I am loved. Mature love follows the principle, I am loved because I love. Immature love says, I love you because I need you. Mature love says, I need you because I love you. Fromm's point that love is an active, not a passive, process has extraordinary importance for the clinician. Patients complain of loneliness, of being unloved and unlovable, but the productive work is always to be done in the opposite realm. Their inability to love. Love is a positive act, not a passive effect. It is giving, not receiving. A standing in, not a falling for. A distinction must be made between giving and depleting. An individual with a hoarding, a receptive, or an exploitative orientation will feel depleted or impoverished by giving. One with a marketing orientation will feel cheated by giving and not receiving. But for the mature, productive person, giving is an expression of strength and abundance. In the act of giving, one expresses and enhances one's alleviance. When one gives, he brings something to life in the other person, and this which is brought to life reflects back to him. In truly giving, he cannot help receiving that which is given back to him. Giving makes the other person a giver also, and they both share in the joy of what they have brought to life. Note how close this is to Buber. Relation is reciprocity. My thou acts on me as I act on it. Our students teach us our works from us. Excruntibly involved, we live in the currents of universal reciprocity. In addition to giving, mature love implies other basic elements: concern, responsivity, respect, and knowledge. To love means to be actively concerned for the life and the growth of another. One must be responsive to the needs, physical and psychic, of the other. One must respect the uniqueness of the other, to see him as he is, and to help him to grow and unfold in his own ways, for his own sake and not for the purpose of serving oneself. But one cannot fully respect the other without knowing that other deeply. True knowledge of the other, Fromm believes, is possible only when one transcends one's self-concern and sees the other person in the other's own terms. One needs to listen and to experience empathically, though Fromm does not use that word. That is, one needs to enter and become familiar with the private world of the other, to live in the other's life and sense the other's meanings and experiences. Note again how Fromm and Buber converge. Compare Fromm's loving and Buber's dialogue and genuine, presuppositionless listening. It is important to the clinician to think of love as attitude, something characteristic of the lover's orientation to the world, rather than in terms of the lover's relationship to his or her love object. Too often we make the mistake of considering exclusive attachment to one person as proof of the intensity and purity of the love. But such a love is, in Fromm's terms, symbiotic love or overinflated egotism and, in the absence of caring of others, is invariably destined to cave in on itself. Needless love is instead an individual's mode of relating to the world. A 40-year-old highly successful executive once consulted me because he had fallen in love with a woman and was in the throes of deciding whether to leave his wife and children. In therapy, after only a few sessions, he became impatient and highly critical of me for general inefficiency and for my failure to offer him a systematic, well-planned course of action. Soon this criticism led us into his highly judgmental attitude toward people in general. In therapy, we proceeded to investigate, not the immediate decision he faced, but his lack of love toward his world at large. Therapy proved of benefit to him by focusing, as effective therapy generally does, on the unexpected. The most fundamental type of love, Fromm believes, is brotherly love. An experience of union with all individuals which is characterized by its very lack of exclusivity. The Bible stresses that the object of love should be the frail, the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. These do not serve a purpose, and to love them is to love in needless, brotherly fashion. I began this section with the question, how is it possible to relate to another in a need-free fashion? Now, in the light of Buber, Maslow, and Fromm's similar conclusions, I shall describe the characteristics of a mature, need-free relationship and then use this prototype to illuminate by contrast the nature of various miscarried relationships. 1. To care for another means to relate in a selfless way. One lets go of self-consciousness and self-awareness. One relates without the overarching thought. What does he think of me? Or, what's in it for me? One does not look for praise, adoration, sexual release, power, money. One relates in the moment solely to the other person. There must be no third party, actual or imagined, observing the encounter. In other words, one must relate with one's whole being, if part of oneself is elsewhere. For example, studying the effect that the relationship will have upon some third person. Then to that extent one has failed to relate. 2. To care for another individual means to know and to experience the other as fully as possible. If one relates selflessly, one is free to experience all parts of the other rather than the part that serves some utilitarian purpose. One extends oneself into the other, recognizing the other as a sentient being who has also constituted a world about himself or herself. 3. To care for another means to care about the being and the growth of the other. With one's full knowledge, gleaned from genuine listening, one endeavors to help the other become fully alive in the moment of encounter. 4. Caring is active. Mature love is loving, not being loved. One gives lovingly to the other. One does not fall for the other. 5. Caring is one's way of being in the world. It is not an exclusive, elusive magical connection with one particular person. 6. Mature caring flows out of one's richness, not out of one's poverty. Out of growth, not out of need. One does not love because one needs the other to exist, to be whole, to escape overwhelming loneliness. One who loves naturally has met these needs at other times, in other ways, not the least of which was the maternal love which flowed toward one in the early phases of life. Past loving, then, is the source of strength. Current loving is the result of strength. 7. Caring is reciprocal. To the extent one really turns toward the other, one is altered. To the extent one brings the other to life, one also becomes more fully alive. 8. Mature caring is not without its rewards. One is altered, one is enriched, one is fulfilled, one's existential loneliness is attenuated. Through caring, one is cared for. Yet these rewards flow from genuine caring. They do not instigate. To borrow Frankel's felicitous wordplay, the rewards ensue but cannot be pursued.